Hello, everyone. I am so excited to have you join us today with the Dr. Nicole Avena, who is going to be talking to us about the science of sugar addiction. Dr. Nicole is a new presenter on our webinar series, and we are so excited to have her. She is a research neuroscientist and expert in the field of nutrition, diet, and addiction. And I mean, what isn't exciting about learning from an expert in this area? She has a PhD in psychology and neuroscience from Princeton University. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship in 2010 at the prestigious Rockefeller University in New York City. She's currently an assistant professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai in New York City, and a visiting professor in health psychology at Princeton University. Not only that, she is a public speaker, published author, has written over and published over 90 scholarly journal articles on topics related to diet, nutrition, and overeating. And get this, she also has a TEDx talk on how sugar affects your brain, which was ranked number 2 and watched over 7 million times. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nicole Avena. Thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, thank you so much, Christy, and thank you for that kind introduction. As I was telling you, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really interested in connecting with the chiropractic community. I think that there's a lot of interest in the type of research that we're doing in my lab and the types of things that are happening in the field right now as it relates to food and addiction. So I'm very excited to be here to speak to you guys about that today. So I want to go through just a little brief overview of what I plan to talk about today in the time we have together. And just so you know, the plan is to have some time at the end for any questions or discussion that might come up. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, but also feel free to save them toward the end because I will save some time for that. So I want to talk a little bit about obesity and the challenges that it poses. I got into this field of looking at sugar addiction and the addictive natures of foods through the lens of obesity, because at the time that I was starting to do this research about 15 years ago, there had been a lot of interest in trying to understand what is the cause of obesity, why are so many people overweight, struggling with obesity, despite the fact that we have a lot of great health advice out there and great information about how people can eat in a way that's healthy to maintain a healthy body weight. But it seemed to be a big challenge for many individuals to stick to those types of healthy eating plans. So I want to talk a little bit about obesity and some of the challenges that it poses from a research standpoint. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the factors that influence food intake. So there's a lot of reasons why people eat. We don't only eat because we're hungry. I think most of us know that there's lots of reasons why we eat aside from hunger. Sometimes we eat because we're bored or lonely or stressed, and so we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. I then want to talk a little bit about the brain systems that regulate the rewarding aspects of food. And so one of the things that we've been doing in my lab, as a neuroscience lab, is to try to understand how does food affect the brain, and in particular, what areas of the brain are being influenced by our food intake. And one of the things that we've been focused on that's a little bit different as of late has been the fact that many of the types of foods that we tend to overeat can affect brain systems that regulate addictive substances like drugs and alcohol. So we'll talk about some of those data. And then I want to talk a little bit about a food reward versus an addiction, because clearly there's a fine line between something being rewarding and something being addictive. And so we tend to throw around the term addiction pretty liberally in our society, and I think it's very important that we be clear in terms of what do we mean when we say something is addictive. And so I'm going to talk about this from the medical standpoint and the diagnostic criteria that are used to define an addiction, and so that way we can qualify what we mean when we try to ask questions regarding whether or not food can be addictive. I then want to talk a little bit about our research and the research from some other labs across the country that has looked at whether or not food can be addictive and whether or not this is something that we can measure in patients, and we can measure this in people who may be struggling with issues related to overeating. So as I'm sure most of you are well aware, we're struggling with this issue of obesity in the United States. And what we're finding is that the percentage of individuals who meet the criteria for being overweight or obese, or even falling into the category of extreme obesity, which means having a BMI of 40 plus, those numbers appear to be growing. And what's most, I think, concerning about the statistics when we look at all this information regarding obesity is that the percentage of individuals who are meeting the criteria for being overweight or obese are growing among young people. So even in categories of children that are ages 2 to 5 or 6 to 11 or 12 to 19, we're seeing that the percentage of the population in those age categories that meets the criteria for being overweight or obese continues to rise. And so this is something that's going to be a problem down the road once these young people become adults as well. Now, we all know that being overweight or obese is an issue because of the comorbid health concerns that can arise due to increased body weight. And so we know that there's a greater chance for heart disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and risk for certain types of cancers and so on. But I think what's something that we don't often think about, which is very important, is the fact that people who are overweight or obese can have psychological and economic and social consequences that are associated with being overweight or obese. And so there's a stigma associated with their body weight status, and that can have a detrimental effect on well-being. And I think it's important to remember that we're talking about a whole person problem, not necessarily just a medical problem when we think about the issues that surround obesity and why we're interested in helping people who are struggling with it. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that was of interest to me when we first started doing this research was why was it that so many people had a hard time regulating their food intake and making food choices that would be in alignment with a healthy diet? And one of the things that became of interest was whether or not some people maybe were not able to have full control over the food choices that they were making. And that's sort of how we became interested in studying this. So I want to point out that obesity is an endpoint, and so we're not going to find a single cure for obesity because there isn't going to be a single cause. We already know that there's multiple contributing factors that lead to obesity. So for instance, things such as sedentary lifestyle. Just as a society, we tend to lead a more sedentary lifestyle. Our jobs require less physical activity these days, and more people are not getting the necessary exercise that's required or suggested that they get in order to maintain a healthy body weight. So that certainly contributes to increased body weight. There's also genetic vulnerability. Some people just have a heightened vulnerability based on their genetics to carry extra body weight, to maybe be overweight or obese. It doesn't mean it's a sentence that they're bound to have that happen, but it does mean that they are at greater risk. There's also changes in food accessibility and the ways in which we acquire food. There's changes regarding social norms about food. So it's pretty much socially acceptable to eat food wherever and whenever you like. We don't really have restrictions on when or where you can bring food items. And even if you think about it, places where it says no food or beverages permitted, people are often eating in those types of places anyway. And so it's pretty much socially acceptable to bring food anywhere you go. It's often welcomed. So if you bring food to a friend's home, or if you bring in cupcakes or something to the office, people tend to think it's wonderful. They're not going to necessarily be mad at you or think that you're a bad person because you brought food into the office. There's also some stress and endocrine factors, which I won't have time to really get into too much detail on today, but these certainly contribute to increased body weight and to increased eating in many cases. And we'll talk a few minutes about portion sizes and how those have gone up over time. And then there are some rare genetic disorders such as Prader-Willi syndrome, which can contribute to obesity, and many individuals will be a side effect of the disease. But what I want to really focus on today is this sort of outlier, if you will, this idea that maybe it's something about the food that we're eating, the specific types of foods that we tend to see in our modern food environment. And these are foods that could be appealing to us in a hedonic fashion. And so something about the rewarding aspects of the foods that we like to eat, could they in some way be contributing to obesity in a way that may be associated with addictive eating? So as I mentioned, our food acquisition and the way we acquire food has changed over the years. And so this is a cartoon that's meant to depict what our ancestors might have looked like. If we were hunters and gatherers, you can imagine that we used to have to hunt for an animal or hunt for a berry bush, or find our food and really work hard to get it. And so back then, you didn't know when you were going to get your next meal, and you really had to work hard to procure it. It wasn't quite so easy to get food. But nowadays, it's relatively easy. And so we have, thanks to industrialization and our modern environment, we have the ability to get access to food relatively cheap, and we have the abilities to store it for relatively long periods of time. And so this is more like what food foraging looks like these days. You go to a big box shopping store and you can order things online and have them delivered to your home. And so the amount of effort that has to be put in is not quite so laborious as it had been for our ancestors. So before I start to talk about the addictive side of this, which is often the sort of more controversial aspect of the question, when people hear that I study food addiction or that I'm researching food addiction, they are often quick to say, well, what do you mean by addiction? And how do you define addiction? And, how do we consider something to be addictive? And I'm going to get into that because that's a very important part of this. But I also think it's a very important part of this discussion to talk about what is a food, because we tend to use the term food pretty broadly, and our government defines the term food as something that's a pretty broad definition, in my opinion. So let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. So this is a nutrition facts label. Now, I'm sure you've all seen this many, many times, and you'll notice that it's changing. This is an older version of what the nutrition facts label looks like. There's a newer version that you'll be seeing on most of the food products that's due to be mandated to be on all of them by, I think, 2020. But what you'll notice is this is a food label that will tell us not only something about the ingredients, but also about the nutritional value of the product. Now, if I asked you to guess what this was a nutrition facts label for, you could look at the list of ingredients on the very bottom, and you could take a wild guess, and you might say, oh, well, it's probably whole baby carrots. And you would be correct, because you can see that if you look at the ingredients, it's simply whole baby carrots, frozen, unprepared. So this is an example of a food, and a food that has a nutrition facts label in our food environment. Now let me give you another example of a food. And again, keep in mind that this food is going to fall under the same rules and regulations and considered basically as the same thing in many ways as whole baby carrots. So if you take a look at this label and try to figure out what food this is, it's not quite as easy. And so if you look at the list of ingredients, you can see that there's lots of different things. So this is a food that is a combination of a variety of different ingredients. Some of them make sense. So obviously it's something that contains flour, which is an ingredient in lots of things. It contains salt. It contains vitamin A, so it's fortified. But it also contains other things like blue 2-lake, which is a colorant to make it appear blue, and a variety of other things, many of which are additives to make the food appear a certain way or smell a certain way or taste a certain way. So the point here is that even though this particular product is considered a food, it's really not on the same level as whole baby carrots. And in part, that is because this is a highly processed food. So Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts are an example of something that's concocted in a laboratory. Scientists sat down and figured out a formula and a recipe to make them taste good and smell good and look good. And this is done on purpose to make them desirable so people will like to eat them and so that they will continue to buy them. And so even though we have the same rules and regulations for this particular product as we do for whole baby carrots, in my opinion, they're completely different types of foods. One is a man-made food. The other one is something that's available in nature. So the big difference between the two is the level of processing. Whole baby carrots are not very highly processed. I mean, they're processed in the sense that maybe we peeled the skin off of them after we pulled them out of the ground and cleaned them a little bit. But you would imagine that something like a Pop-Tart or some of these other types of processed foods are completely processed. And so someone might say, okay, well, what's the big deal about processing? You have to process food to eat it on some level. You have to sear a steak. You have to cook an egg. I mean, this is all part of our appetitive process. And that is true to some extent, but I think that there are some examples I want to give you that maybe will illustrate why processing of food, especially when you highly process a food, can change it and change it from something that maybe was once a healthy food product to something that can be completely different once you process it. So here's a couple of examples from nature. So this is an example of a coca leaf. Now, in parts of the world where coca leaves are grown, people who live there indigenously will chew on the leaves. I've been in the field of psychology and psychiatry for many years now, and I've never met one person ever who's been addicted to coca leaves. However, I have unfortunately met many individuals who've suffered from cocaine or crack cocaine addiction. And if you take a coca leaf and you process it and extract all the good stuff and add a bunch of chemicals to it, you can turn it into cocaine or crack cocaine very easily. Excuse me. Excuse me, I have a terrible cold, so you have to bear with me. So a couple other examples. Grapes. Grapes can be a delicious fruit that many people enjoy, but if you process them, extract all the good stuff, and add a bunch of chemicals to it, you can turn a grape-based product into something that can be highly addictive for some individuals. So the question that we've been considering is, could the same be said of something that's a corn-based product, or maybe even a wheat-based product? Or if you take water and sugar cane, which, again, alone in nature are relatively harmless and in many ways very good for us, but if you put them together and highly process them, could you turn them into something that many people might have a difficult time regulating their intake of? So we started off doing our research on food addiction looking at sugar, and this was done for a few different reasons. One was because there had been a fair amount of anecdotal reports in the literature of people talking about having an addiction to sugar, feeling compelled to overeat sugar-rich foods and carbohydrates. And so it seemed that there was a very strong qualitative component to this idea that sugar might play a role in overeating. There wasn't much in terms of empirical research on this topic, but there was enough out there in terms of clinical reports and people talking about it that it seemed to be something that was worthy of study. Also, there had been a fair number of research studies that had been looking at the correlation between sugar consumption in the United States and the rise in the obesity epidemic. So there had been some evidence that as Americans were consuming more and more sugar, the obesity rates were rising. So when we look at the data on how much sugar Americans are actually eating, we know that it's kind of a lot. And so this is data from the National Cancer Institute from back in 2010. But even back then, the average American, regardless of body weight, was consuming 22 teaspoons of added sugar each day. Now, keep in mind, added sugar is sugar that comes from sources that are added to the food products. So we're not talking about fruits. We're not talking about naturally occurring sugar that would be found in some milks. We're talking about sugar that you're adding to your food, or we're talking about sugar that the food industry is adding to the foods when they prepare them. So for many people, we weren't quite sure whether or not that was a lot of sugar or not, because up until only a few years ago, we didn't have guidelines. We didn't really have any indication of how much sugar was too much sugar, but now we do. So we have the new dietary guidelines for Americans, and they recommend that no more than 10% of your daily calorie intake come from added sugar. So just to kind of break down the math really quickly, this basically means that if you're on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, you should have no more than approximately 10 to 12 teaspoons of added sugar each day. And depending on the governing body that you're talking to, some actually recommend less. If we're talking about children, the recommendation is even less than that. So let's take a look at some examples, because again, telling people don't have any more than 10 teaspoons of sugar, of sugar each day is kind of a tall order, especially because we don't walk around with, teaspoons in our pockets to measure how much sugar is in these products. And a lot of times the sugar is hidden in the products because we don't even know that it's added. So just to give a couple of examples, here's an example of a Starbucks Frappuccino, which I'm sure many people have enjoyed. And if you have just one of these, you're going to have over your daily allotment of added sugar. So just in one, you've already gone over the amount of added sugar you're supposed to have in the entire day. And so let's look at another product, something like a CINNABON. Sometimes people enjoy these for dessert or have something similar, maybe even for a breakfast item. And if you have just one of these, you're already over, again, your daily value of amount of sugar that you're supposed to have. And so one would argue, okay, well, we know that CINNABONs and Starbucks Frappuccinos are not exactly healthy. Everybody knows you're kind of supposed to restrict those or limit those. What about something that maybe most people would perceive as a healthy product? So something like yogurt, for instance. Many people have yogurt for breakfast or as part of their diet each day. But even just one cup of yogurt, one serving of yogurt, has almost half of the daily value of added sugar. So the point here, and I've done this other presentations where I pretty much just go through a whole bunch of foods like this because it's often quite fun to see how much sugar is in all these things, and it's scary and surprising at the same time. But the point here is that it's very easy to go over the daily allotment that you're supposed to have of added sugar, even just by breakfast, by having just a few of these different processed foods that are out there. So most of us are eating much more than we should be to begin with. I mentioned that portion sizes are going up. And so these are data from the CDC that show the average portion size of a typical fast food type restaurant back in the 50s compared to now. And you can see it's not just the size of the sugar sweetened beverages that has gone up, but it's also the size of the actual food, so the hamburger and the French fries. And so we're seeing that our portion sizes are going up over time as well. And we know from research that's looked at the psychology of portion sizes that the portion that's put in front of us is perceived to be the amount that we're supposed to eat. And so if you give people larger portions, they are going to eat larger amounts of food regardless of their hunger levels. So we've been interested in what happens in the brain when people eat these types of foods that maybe are loaded with sugar or are extremely processed and reinforcing. One of the things that we know about the brain is that drugs that are abused, so things like nicotine, cocaine, alcohol, morphine, they act on brain systems that reinforce natural behaviors. So in order to survive as a species, we need to engage in certain behaviors like sexual behavior and feeding behavior. And so it makes sense that those behaviors were designed to feel good so that we would continue to do them and they would be considered reinforcing. That's the way we get ourselves to continue to do something. If it's reinforcing, then we're going to want to do it again and again and again. And so drugs of abuse hijack those brain systems and they set them into overdrive, and that's why so many people become addicted to drugs of abuse, because the pleasure that's derived from using the drugs activates these primitive brain systems in a way that makes people develop an addiction. So the point is that there's overlaps in the brain systems that regulate our food intake and our addictions. And so the argument that we've been making is that, well, maybe some of these foods, these designer foods like Pop-Tarts and these other things that are really just designed to taste delicious, could they be in some ways more like a drug and less like a food in terms of how they affect the brain? So there's more than one type of hunger. We tend to think about hunger as being that hunger you get when you haven't had enough to eat. And we have these sort of hunger pangs and growling, if you will, in our stomachs. And certainly that is one type of hunger. Hunger is, a feeling of weakness that's coupled with a desire to eat. But there's also another type of hunger, and this is a hedonically driven hunger. This is where someone wants to eat just because the food tastes good. This is what happens when you've just had a completely delicious meal and you've had more than enough calories, but maybe the server comes around and says, oh, would you like some dessert? And suddenly you find that you're hungry for a piece of cake or ice cream. And so this is another type of hunger that's known as hedonic hunger. And this is where you're hungry, but not necessarily for caloric need, but because it makes you feel good to eat whatever food you're about to eat. One of the things that we know about these hedonically driven motives to eat is that people sometimes eat simply because they're interested in feeling good for some reason or another. And so it's not necessarily because they're hungry per se and in need of calories, but maybe because they're bored and they need a distraction, or maybe they're stressed and they need a source of a way to alleviate their anxiety, or maybe they're lonely and they just need something to sort of make them perk up and feel a little bit better. And when we look at the types of foods that people tend to eat in these situations, they tend to be foods that are high in calories, high in sugars and fats. And that's because those types of foods taste good than things that are low in calories and low in sugar and low in fats. These types of palatable foods are also relatively ubiquitous for most people in our society. And so if you go to grocery stores or if you go to convenience stores, you're going to see that the types of foods that are available are more often going to be these shelf-stable foods that are going to have this hedonic appeal, that are going to have added sugars and added fats, as opposed to things that are not shelf-stable that are going to expire in a couple of days. So if you were a clerk who owned, let's just say, a small convenience store, you're better off stocking it with shelf-stable chips and, things that are going to last for a while than you are carrots and apples that are going to expire and go bad in a couple of days, because if people don't buy those things, you're losing all your profit margin. You're going to have to throw them away. So the question that we've asked is, are we addicted to highly processed foods, and in particular foods that contain lots of added sugars? And so one of the things that we've done to define whether or not something is addictive is to use the DSM-5. And so the DSM-5, for those of you who aren't aware, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the 5th edition. And so this is essentially the book that lots of different medical professionals will use to define whether or not someone meets the criteria for having a psychiatric or a mental disorder. And so in this book, we have a definition for substance use disorder, which is classically known as addiction. And so there's a few different criteria that one needs to meet. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I will talk just briefly about each of the different criteria classes. And so there's a criteria for having impaired control. And so you need to show evidence that you're binging or you have a desire or limit to quit the substance, but you're unable to do so, or that you expend an excessive amount of time thinking about the substance or using the substance, or you're craving the substance. There's also a social impairment criteria. And again, the social impairment criteria is largely dictated by social norms. And so I want you to think back, those of you who are on the call who maybe can remember back when smoking was much more prevalent in the United States than it is now. A lot of the reasons why we don't have smoking as prevalent as it was back 20 or 30 years ago is because of social norms and social rules regarding smoking. There's now laws and regulations that are in place that prevent people from smoking in most places, and that's part of the reason why we don't see it as commonly as we had in the past. But just to keep that into mind, that if you were to have a social impairment, it might mean that you have a failure to fulfill a major role obligation. So if you were not showing up at work because you're too busy using a substance, or you have interpersonal problems because of the use of the substance, you have to give up activities because of the use of the substance. Right now, we don't see this happening so much with food because we don't have restrictions on how much you can eat or when you can eat or what you can eat. And so this is a little bit more tricky to understand within respect to food addiction. But risky use is one that we certainly do see, using a substance even though it's physically hazardous to us. Also using a substance even though you know it's causing you physical or psychological problems. And then there's pharmacological criteria. So using a substance that produces tolerance, meaning you need to consume more and more of it to feel the same euphoria you used to get from maybe just consuming a small amount of it. The classic example for tolerance is alcohol. People who consume alcohol, when they first start consuming it, they might feel buzzed or intoxicated after just 1 or even 2 drinks. But the more you drink, the greater your tolerance becomes to it. And so you then need more and more alcoholic beverages in order to feel the euphoria that you used to get from just a few. And also, some drugs of abuse can produce withdrawal. Not all drugs of abuse produce withdrawal. So withdrawal is not a criteria for addiction. So drugs that are huffed, cocaine, they don't produce withdrawal. But there are drugs that are more classically known that do have a very profound withdrawal syndrome. So certainly opiates are one example of drugs that produce a clear withdrawal syndrome. So these are the criteria that are used as the framework to understand whether or not something can be addictive. Now, according to the DSM, you don't need to meet all of these criteria, but you do need to meet some of them for a protracted period of time. And so this is what we've been using as our framework to try to understand whether or not some individuals could meet the criteria for having an addiction when the substance is a highly palatable food. So we've adapted these criteria to study both in clinical studies, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also in animal models. So I want to talk about some of the animal data first. We developed an animal model because, in part, we were interested in looking at the brain, and so it makes a lot more sense in many cases to look at neurotransmitters in the brain of animal models, but also in part because in order to have a very clear control group where you have animals that have not been exposed to sugar, it's very difficult to do that in humans because I don't know any humans that haven't been eating sugar for many, many years, and so it's difficult to do some of these studies in a controlled fashion in human models. So we just developed this animal model where we had our rats that were offered a sugar solution to drink, and they also had their rat food available. They also had water available, so they're never forced to consume the sugar solution. And what we found is that if you give a sugar solution to these animals on a limited daily access, meaning they get it for 12 hours a day, they come to develop this pattern where they drink more and more of it over the course of about a month. And it's interesting because they drink more than animals that have it available 24/7. So it's almost like this limited daily access produces this tolerance, if you will, to it, where they're consuming more and more each day. We also were interested in looking at whether or not the animals would binge. And so when we look at the first hour of access each day, we find that over the course of a month, they do in fact binge in that first hour. So they miss it when they don't have it, and they can consume a large meal of it when they do get access to the sugar every time it's administered. What's interesting is we have a control group that gets just 12 hours a day access to their rat food and water. And we wondered whether or not these rats would binge on their rat food. And they don't. They just eat it in a normal way. And so it's interesting that it's only the highly palatable sugar that seems to produce this binge-like behavior. The rats don't seem to binge on the healthy stuff. So we use a couple different techniques in my lab, but one of them is a technique called microdialysis, where we can look at neurotransmitters as they're being released into the extracellular fluid in the brain while the animal is awake and moving around. And what we find is that if we look at the brains of these animals while they're drinking sugar, they release dopamine. And dopamine is one of the neurochemicals that's associated with reward and reinforcement. It's also the hallmark of drug use, meaning that every time you use a drug of abuse, it releases dopamine. Whether it's morphine, nicotine, cocaine, they all release dopamine. Food typically releases dopamine the very first time you eat it, but then it kind of peters away, meaning that once you become accustomed to eating a certain type of food, you no longer release dopamine in response to it. So the question we had for this particular experiment was, well, are these rats going to release dopamine when they're drinking sugar in a way that's like a drug, meaning every time they get the sugar, they're going to release dopamine? Or is it going to be like a normal food, meaning after they've had it a couple times, they're no longer going to release dopamine? And what we found was that, in fact, every time they get the sugar and they binge on it, they're releasing dopamine. And so it's acting in many ways more like a drug in terms of what it's doing to the dopamine system than what it's doing to than what would be expected to happen with a food. And again, we have a control group where we have rats that are just getting limited daily access to their healthy rat food, and these animals do not show that change in dopamine. So it's only the animals that are binging on the highly palatable sugar that show this response in the dopamine system that looks like a drug. We also see signs of withdrawal in these rats. And so if we take the sugar away or we precipitate withdrawal by giving them a low dose of a drug that can affect the opioid system, they'll show signs of anxiety, they'll show signs of distress, they'll show signs of depression, they'll also show somatic indications that they are in a negative state. We can measure the distress and the anxiety in these animals using the image that's pictured here, which is called an elevated plus maze. And when animals are in withdrawal, they're less willing to explore the maze, which is indicative that they're anxious, and that's indeed what we found in our studies. When we look at the brains of these animals, we also see neurochemical changes that are consistent with an addiction and a withdrawal. And so we see a decrease in dopamine during withdrawal when we take the sugar away from the animals, and that's coupled with an increase in another transmitter called acetylcholine. And again, this is in reward-related brain regions. In this particular study, it was in the nucleus accumbens. And again, what's interesting about these data is that this is the same profile of a decrease in dopamine coupled with an increase in acetylcholine that you would expect to see during withdrawal from a drug of abuse. But in our case here, we're seeing this with sugar, and it's been published in other studies that this same profile of low dopamine with increased acetylcholine is found during withdrawal from drugs like morphine or nicotine or cocaine. We've also noted that animals will show signs of cross-sensitization to drugs of abuse when they have a history of overeating sugar. And I think this is really interesting because when we think about the types of diets that many Americans are on and the proclivity to use drugs like alcohol and opiates and other things that are happening in our society, I think that there's certainly a link between nutrition and addiction with that respect that is something that I'm really interested in exploring more. But from our basic animal models, we were able to show that animals that have a history of overeating sugar, if you give them a low dose of amphetamine, which is a dopamine agonist, they'll be hyperactive in response to it. And this is presumably due to the fact that, as we've shown, when they eat the sugar, it's producing changes in their dopamine system that is causing that to be altered, and that is now manifested as hyperactivity when you give them a dopaminergic agonist drug. We've also noted that the animals that have a history of overeating sugar are also more likely to consume alcohol. So if they have a choice and they're given alcohol, if they have a history of eating sugar, they're going to drink the higher concentrations. And so this suggests that there is a link between substance use and polysubstance use when it comes to sugar being involved. Craving is something that we've also tried to assess in our rat models. It's a little more difficult because, humans can articulate and tell you that they're craving something or they want something, and rats obviously can't do that, but we can come up with clever ways to test whether or not they're willing to engage in risky behaviors in order to get things, which suggests that they are craving them. The top graph is actually data from a colleague of mine. Her name is Mary Baggiano, and she's done some studies looking at binge-eating prone and binge-eating resistant rats. And what she finds is the rats that are prone to binge eating are more willing to cross an electrified shock grid to get access to an M&M compared to rats that are resistant to binge eating. So this suggests that there is some evidence that these animals are craving the sugar, because I'm sure you'll imagine that, and agree with me that it's pretty stupid to cross an electrified shock grid, and it's also pretty stupid to do it if your only reward is one little M&M. But nonetheless, these animals that have a history of binge eating and are prone to it will engage in that type of behavior. And we've also shown in some other studies, too, that animals that have a history of overeating sugar are more willing to work hard to get access to the sugar. So we've done some work largely in animal models when we first started doing this research about 15 years ago, but we've moved quickly into clinical examples because it's important to have translational research, especially when it comes to a subject like this, which is so clinical in nature. A colleague of mine, Ashley Gerhardt, she developed something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And it's basically a paper and pencil test that you can give to patients, and it uses those DSM criteria for addiction that we talked about a few minutes ago, but it essentially tweaks them to be questions about eating behavior instead. And so it's a Likert type of questionnaire, and it asks people things like, I find myself continuing to consume certain foods even though no longer hungry, or I eat to the point where I feel physically ill. And so it's a self-report, and there's a way in which you can score it and get an indication of whether or not someone meets the criteria for having a food addiction. And so just to give you some of the data that have come out of the scale came out a few years back, a few years after we started publishing our rat studies on this topic. And at the time when the scale first came out, it was tested in a group of undergraduates, which is typical for scale development. And it was found that 11% of the population met the criteria for having a food addiction. Now you might say, well, that doesn't sound very high because, we're talking about maybe, 50 to 60% of the population having obesity or being overweight. But if you think about addiction, when we look at the population as a whole, about 10% of the population has an addiction to drugs. So I think it is indicative of the percentages that we're expecting to see when we're talking about addiction. Now, if we focus in on those that are at higher risk, like individuals who have obesity, we see that 25% meet the criteria for having a food addiction in studies. And then if you focus in even further on those at greater risk, such as people who have obesity and also comorbid binge eating disorder, then the percentages go up even greater to over 50% of the participants in those studies meeting the criteria for having a food addiction. There have been some neurochemical studies that have been done in humans looking at this as well. And so one of the ones that I like to highlight was a study that was done a few years back that used functional brain imaging and was able to correlate scores on the Yale Food Addiction Scale with activation in reward-related brain regions in response to a milkshake. And so individuals who scored higher on the food addiction scale also showed greater neural activity in areas of the brain associated with reward when they were cued by a picture of a milkshake. So most recently, we've been interested in trying to get into understanding which foods are addictive, because we know it's important to understand the ingredients and the properties of the foods that are addictive. But in order to help people to make better choices about their food, we really need to be able to tell people which foods might be addictive and why, so that people can make better choices, and maybe so that the food companies can create better products that won't have these addictive criteria, but people can still enjoy them. So this is some data that came out of our group not too long ago, where we were looking at the most problematic foods and trying to identify which foods would be identified as most addictive. And probably not surprising to anyone, we discovered that the most addictive food was found to be pizza, followed by chocolate, chips, cookies, and then ice cream. And the least addictive foods were found to be cucumbers, carrots, beans, apples, and brown rice. Now, again, we weren't able to look at all of the foods that were out there. This was a relatively small set of foods that we were able to assess, but we have some plans to do some additional studies where we'll have larger sets of foods for to be able to assess. one of the things that was, I think, very important that came out of these data was that when we did the factor analysis to try to understand what are the features of the foods that were identified as being addictive, the largest positive predictor of whether or not a food was identified by the participants to be addictive was the level of processing. So the more highly processed the food, the more likely it was to be identified as being addictive. So that's, I think, an important point because it highlights the fact that processing does play a role here. So I just want to kind of end with a few sort of, I think, final thoughts and talking points about this. And so one of the things that comes up a lot when I talk about this topic, and I speak on this topic quite frequently because there's lots of different groups that are interested in hearing about this because I think addiction and obesity touches all of us in one way, shape, or form. If it's not something that we're personally affected by, it's something that individuals in our life are affected by. And one of the things that often comes back to me in terms of a rebuttal is, well, is it really like an addiction? What about the loss of control that we typically see when you think about an addiction? And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect with that because I think partly that most people have this false impression that an addict is the person that's pictured in the top, right? And so the person might have this extreme loss of control where they're using this substance and they don't care if they have a job, they don't care about their family, and the substance is really the only thing that's motivating them to live. And I think for some individuals, unfortunately, this is the case, and it's very sad that this is the case. But I think if we're going to think about food addiction, we have to keep in mind that the person on the top is not the most common addict out there. The most common addict out there is the person on the bottom, and this is a smoker. And because this person is likely a fully functioning individual, they have little noticeable intoxication, the withdrawal syndrome is not physically life-threatening, we don't tend to always view these people as addicts. But when we look at the effects of the addiction to nicotine, because of smoking's health-related complications, it's a number one cause of preventable death in the United States. And so I think when we think about addiction and highly palatable foods, I think we need to consider them within the context of people being addicted to things like cigarettes and not so much this idea of addiction being something that is, just seen among people who are addicted to other types of drugs. So to summarize, this is some data that was taken from a review paper that a colleague wrote a few years back where they took all the different criteria for addiction according to the DSM and kind of put them out there and said which ones had been met with animal models and which ones had been met with clinical studies. And you can see that all of them have been met with both. And so if we're talking about addiction to food, we can say that there has been a significant amount of evidence that supports the idea that addiction to food can exist when we're using those DSM criteria for addiction. I want to then just end by thanking you for listening. Also, I would love to thank my supporters, people who funded the research over the years. I also want to point out, as Chrissy mentioned earlier, that I have a TED Ed video that I partnered with TED to create this really great 5-minute animated video that pretty much does everything I just took an hour to say to you and puts it into this 5-minute really great animated video. So definitely check that out. It's called What Sugar Does to Your Brain. It's great to show children. Young kids are big fans of it because of the way it's animated. And it really illustrates the whole concept of what happens in your brain when you consume too much sugar. And then I'm happy to stay in touch. Here's my email and my social media handle, and I have some books. So if you're interested in getting more information, please feel free to use these resources and to reach out to me. Okay, so I have a couple of questions that are listed here in the chat, so I'm just going to read those out loud. And then if anyone else has questions, feel free to chime in. So Steve is asking the best methods to get 13-year-olds off the sugar addiction. Well, that's a great question. I can certainly relate to that personally as well. I have a 10-year-old, soon to be 11-year-old, and I can certainly relate to the fact that kids that age are exposed to lots of different sweets, and it's often out of our control. I was amazed, Christy and I were talking about this a little bit before the webinar, the amount of loss of control parents have when they send their children to school because, candy and sweets are really just everywhere, and no one ever really asks parents if it's okay for their children to have these things. I think that one of the key things I would say in terms of advice when it comes to trying to get kids off of eating too much sugar, especially at that age, it's not about punishing them or policing them, but it's about getting them to understand it from a health perspective. And so I think, at that age, children are certainly old enough to understand why they need to take care of their bodies. They can understand the concept of fatty liver disease. They can understand the concept that if they eat too much sugar and eat in unhealthy ways, that it can affect their bodily organs, and that type of damage can be difficult to reverse as they get older. And so I think having these discussions be framed more around the health consequences and the dangers as opposed to just, don't eat it because it's not good for you. I think that is really key at this age. And even for younger children, it's not, I always suggest, never come at it from a standpoint of it being bad. It's only about health, and it's about promoting healthy behaviors. And I think offering alternatives is really the key too, because kids still want to be able to engage in, eating cupcakes, eating cakes and sweets, and that's okay, but it just needs to be done in moderation. And kids need some guidance in terms of what that moderation looks like. Is it once a day? Is it once a week? I mean, that's really for the parents to decide. But I think that giving children guidelines about, what is an acceptable amount and, why you shouldn't overdo it all the time is really key, and they need some guidance and help to figure that out. Okay, so another question that's coming from Michelle is, does your body and brain tell the difference between processed sugar versus honey? Great question, and this is something I get quite a bit on. And so the short answer is no, meaning that when we consume sugar, whether or not it's in a natural form, like something like honey, or people often talk about even low-calorie or non-calorie sweeteners like stevia. These are still affecting the sweet taste receptors, which are then affecting your neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine, and it's signaling to your brain that this is sugar and this tastes good and this is rewarding. So regardless of the source of sugar, in terms of how it affects your brain, there's really not much of a difference. You're still going to feel that same euphoria that you would get regardless of the source. Depending on the type of sweetener, there are slight differences in terms of how they affect insulin response. But again, I think, overall, if the goal is to cut back on sugar or cut back on, eating sweets, replacing them with things like honey is not going to be the answer, because you're still going to have that craving and you're still going to, have that desire to eat them. I say that it's a great crutch to kind of move from the processed sugar to maybe less processed sugar to then maybe, non-caloric sweeteners. But the ultimate goal should be to try to just remove sweet from the diet as much as possible, because a lot of our diet is just completely over-sweetened, and it could be sweetened in more healthy ways by like whole fruits. Whole fruit is great because it has, all of the nutrients that are in the fruit, and it also has the sweetness from the fructose and the sucrose. Fruit compote or, fruit extracts or fruit concentrates are not good sweeteners because you're sucking out all the nutrients and just leaving back the sugars. And so those aren't really great alternatives for sweet. Okay, let me just see if there's other questions. I'm not seeing anything else right now. But you have my contact information, so if after the fact anyone does have any questions or would like further information, please, feel free to reach out. And I'm really interested in connecting with the chiropractic community, so do please feel free to share this information and my website with others that may be interested.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avena, for that awesome webinar. Just remember that the webinar recording will be posted on the website in about half an hour, and that it will be available for ever, actually. It will be available forever because we're switching to a new platform and a way to store these. So you'll be able to go back, listen to this webinar at any time. Feel free to share the link with your colleagues, and make sure you connect with Dr. Avena, follow her on social. If you have questions, you can email or reach out to her on social, or you can email me and I will make sure to connect, send your question to her, because I'm sure a lot of you are like me where you think of the question 30 minutes after the webinar is over. So just a reminder, next week we have Garrett Gunderson talking about cash flow optimization, how to keep a lot more of what you make. We're super excited about that. We have a couple more webinars in May. They have not posted to our website yet, but they will be on the webinar reminder email that you get later this week, or you can email me directly and I will send you the link for them to become available. But be looking out for Sean Deal is going to be on the webinar series, along with Dr. Fab Mancini, who's going to be talking about CBD oil. So we have a lot of great stuff, and we have a surprise webinar. Y'all are going to be the first to know. We have the Tim Grover, who is the trainer behind most NBA superstars, including Michael Jordan. My brain is just kind of like phased out, but he is going to be doing a webinar for us later this month, so look to see that on our website in the next day or two. But it's going to be called Relentless, because he is the man who gets those athletes out of their own heads and back on the court. So Kobe Bryant, if you're an NBA fan, then I'm sure you've heard of Tim. But anyway, he's going to be talking to us later this month. So be on the lookout for reminders about those webinars coming out. And again, if you have questions for Nicole after today, please feel free to reply back to your email with the link to the recording and say, hey, Christy, can you pass this along? And I will absolutely do that. We look forward to having Dr. Nicole back in the next couple of months. And yes, Dr. Scott, I am positive. He actually was working with Michael Jordan back in the day. He works, oh gosh, there's so many people. It's because I'm fixing to go to his website. I'm just going to look it up. You can look it up at relentless.com or timgrover.com. He wrote the book Relentless. And there's so many NBA players. Michael Jordan, it's because I'm old school, and that's the one I remembered first. But it's like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade, who is somebody who is playing in the NBA recently. But anyway, or you can even watch him on YouTube. So, yes, I am positive that is who we are having on here. He is the trainer who worked with all of those amazing stars. And he wrote the book Relentless, From Good to Great to Unstoppable. So check it out. Like I said, be looking for more information on that. We should have it posted on our website in the next couple of days. Anyway, Dr. Nicole, thank you so much for being here today. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, and thanks everyone for your time and for paying attention.
All right, everyone, have an amazing rest of your day and a fabulous week, and we'll see you here next week with Garrett Gunderson while we talk about the money, the money, the money. Y'all have an awesome time. See you soon. Bye-bye. All right, that is a wrap.